So I kind of want to understand maybe how all of that aspect fits into this agreement, or maybe it doesn't at all fit into the agreement. Maybe it sits outside of it. Do you see that unique Pakistani policy and its arsenal and all those kind of things as part of this agreement or outside of it? I mean, what is the expectation from Pakistan and from the other parties?
So thank you so much for this question, Umar. As you rightly say, Pakistan's geography makes its participation particularly interesting because it sits at the intersection of several different strategic systems. It is simultaneously a South Asian state, a neighbor of Iran and Afghanistan, and closely connected to the Gulf, strategically aligned with China, and historically linked to Western security structures. But geography also creates constraints. I often say that geography is both a curse and a blessing. So Pakistan's principal military threat perception remains centered on India, and that's not going to change. Saudi Arabia and Türkiye have very different threat perceptions, like I said earlier, and those differences, should not be underestimated. The three countries may share strategic interests, but they do not necessarily share a common adversary. That distinction is extremely important because a durable security arrangement, it cannot simply assume that one state's threat automatically becomes every other state's threat. That's not what's happening here. So I don't think that, Pakistan would want the Makkah Agreement to internationalize its India-centric security competition, nor would Saudi Arabia necessarily want its security relationship with Pakistan to become hostage to India-Pakistan crises. And similarly, Pakistan would be cautious about allowing the arrangement to automatically draw it into every Gulf or Middle Eastern confrontation. So in that sense, the sustainability of the agreement will depend on how clearly the three parties distinguish between collective defense, collective deterrence, and broad strategic consultation. So Pakistan's nuclear weapons introduce another layer of complexity. As you rightly said, Pakistan is the only nuclear-armed member of this arrangement, and inevitably that creates questions about whether its nuclear capability somehow extends the deterrent umbrella of the agreement. I will be very careful about making that assumption. Pakistan's nuclear doctrine, its force posture, its command and control architecture have historically been developed primarily in relation to its deterrence requirements vis-a-vis India, and there is a significant conceptual and operational distance between possessing nuclear weapons and extending nuclear deterrence to another state. The United States does that, is the only state with a huge extended nuclear deterrence architecture. Extended deterrence, just to, say a few words so that there is more clarity, it requires much more than political language. It requires clarity regarding the circumstances under which nuclear weapons might be used, credible signaling might be done, command and control arrangements be done, consultation mechanisms, and ultimately the willingness to risk one's own territory in defense of an ally. So we simply do not have the evidence that the Makkah Agreement or even the previous bilateral SDMA between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan creates that kind of a nuclear commitment. So I would not describe this as a Pakistani nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia or Türkiye. At the same time, Pakistan's nuclear status does matter indirectly. It gives Pakistan a particular strategic weight within the arrangement, and it contributes to the overall, deterrent profile of the three states. But that is different from saying that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal has somehow become a collective asset. I think the important question that I grapple with is that whether this agreement can generate meaningful collective deterrence without requiring formal nuclear extended deterrence. And that would mean that these three countries strengthen conventional military cooperation, they strengthen intelligence sharing, interoperability, defense industrial collaboration, they do joint exercises, crisis consultation, and political signaling. And if those mechanisms become credible, then I believe that the agreement could raise the cost of aggression without ever needing to, explicitly nuclearizing this arrangement. And for Pakistan, that distinction is particularly valuable. It allows Islamabad to, contribute significant strategic weight to a wider regional security architecture while preserving the essentially national character of its nuclear deterrent. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that's very interesting. So, defining the limits, I think, of this agreement is not just important for its own sake, the sustainability you see it of the agreement, and for the development of the other aspects of creating meaningful deterrence from a kind of a military interoperability perspective. So, as long as if you don't believe that the nuclear umbrella extends to you, then you're going to have to work on all these other dimensions of it. Is that a fair assessment from your point of view? And there's one thing just to add. I mean, something that Aziz said that I kind of forgot about at the moment, but he talked about mitigating threats from a Saudi point of view, and that diplomacy was one of the values of this. Is that because Pakistan and Türkiye have relations with Iran and can lean on their diplomatic wherewithal when it comes to deterrence as well? It's not just the military aspect of it, but these states have far-reaching foreign policy relations with in the region and beyond that they can lean on. That's an asset, I think, to this.
Absolutely. I think meaningful deterrence does not require the agreement to deter every conceivable threat, nor does it require every member to share an identical threat perception. It requires potential adversary to believe that aggression will generate costs greater than the benefits. So for Saudi Arabia, for example, those costs can be created through several layers of stronger conventional capabilities, military interoperability, inter-cooperation, defense industrial collaboration, and perhaps most importantly, the uncertainty created when an adversary knows that a crisis involving one state may engage the political and military interests of the two others. And I think that's where the strength of the Makkah Agreement with Pakistan and Türkiye on board lies. But also, just to comment on the Saudi strategy, it cannot rest on deterrence alone. Diplomacy is an essential part of the architecture, and Riyadh has spent recent years trying to reduce regional tensions. It has tried to diversify its relationships and prevent conflicts from, disrupting its economic transformation. So an agreement that simply reproduces bloc politics would work against that objective. And I think none of the three parties, want that to happen. So, ultimately, where deterrence and diplomacy reinforce one another, and deterrence raises the cost of coercion, diplomacy provides the adversary with an alternative to it. And a successful Makkah framework would need both.